Jujutsu Kaisen is undoubtedly one of the biggest anime that is currently out there. Peak fights, peak animation, and peak literalism. Because genuinely, this fandom cannot read. Anyways, it's been like 3 years since I've made anything JJK related. The last figure I made was Toji, and with the new season I thought, let's make the person who is his equal. Now, as many of you perchance know, Maki doesn't really like her clan. She may or may not have slaughtered everyone, allegedly. Jokes aside, episode 4 was amazing, so I definitely had to capture that in my figure. Since the slaughter took place at the Zenin clan, which appears to be a traditional Japanese house, I wanted to make the floor of the base appear like tatami mats. Usually, tatami mats are quite big, but since I don't have that kind of wood lying around, I just use wooden pallets, cut them into pieces of 3.5 centimeters and glued them onto the base. As for the pattern, I put 2 pieces next to each other and aligned them perpendicular to each other. And being the genius that I am, I forgot to record that. Anyway, since most of the wooden plates were standing above the edge of the wooden plate, the only thing that I had to do was cut the axis off and make the base round again. And that's the base basically finished. The only additional thing that I did off cam was add black acrylic paint into the cracks of this base. That way the pattern is more visible. With the base finished, it was now time to make Maki. As always with my figures, I'm starting with the skeleton. For that I'm gluing steel wire for the legs and aluminum wire for the arms together and cover the entire thing with clay. Since Maki has gotten muscular after the heavenly restriction, I tried to somewhat outline them while sculpting, since most of it will be covered by the folds of the legs anyway. Since the legs are now full of clay, I continued by starting to make the boots. Pretty simple, just add a piece of clay in the length of the foot and cut it to the shape that you need it. And since I'm making boots, I had to make them a bit taller than I would do regular feet to make the heels. As a final detail for the shoe, the only thing I needed to make was the sole, which I basically just carved into the clay. And of course I also added a few creases onto the shoes themselves. With the boots set and done, it was now time to make the pants. Since the leg opening is somewhat covering the boots, I added a thin clay strip as well as a few clay noodles onto the bottom of the leg and blended them smooth to make the wrinkles. And the exact same thing was then done to the knees as well as the hip area. I just added some clay noodles onto the section where it would make sense, blended them smooth, and yeah, there you have it. That's how I make the pants. The only thing missing was to add a thin clay strip around the waist to make the belt. I then also added the seam line of the pants. I often get asked the question whether I bake my figures in between steps, and the answer is yes. Here's a good example. The bottom half of Maki is now done, so I decided that I would bake it in order to not ruin any detail. I took off the clay from the upper body and baked the bottom part, and once it's hard, I put the clay back on so that I can finally work on the upper body. Since there's no clay on the arms yet, I added the basic shape of the muscles and blended them smooth. Once the arms were smoothened out, I added the chest. Usually I'm having a bit of a problem sculpting the chest, but luckily since she's wearing a shirt, it was much easier. Now that the basic shape of the upper body is done, the only thing I had to do was refine the muscles and add some further detail. That means sculpting the shoulders properly, as well as the triceps and the biceps. I'm starting to understand how the overall muscles flow from the triceps and especially how the forearm muscles are. That said, I also added some muscles on the back, which the good thing is most of them are gonna be covered, but I still wanted to make them a bit shine through, kinda reminiscent of Toji's compression shirt. At this point I've spent like a week correcting and perfecting the arms to the point that I'm satisfied, so I can finally move on and do the wrinkles of the shirt. As I've just stated, I wanted it to appear kind of like a compression shirt, so what I had to do was, just like I did with the legs, add tiny clay noodles and blend them smooth. It was at this point where I realized that I still needed to add the belt holders, which I did by adding thin clay strips onto the waist. And to finish off the belt, the only thing I had to do was add the metal piece. With that said and done, it is now time to sculpt the head. As always, roll out a piece of clay into a ball, add the chin and try to get the shape right. Once you think you got the shape somewhat correctly, add the eye socket and then the nose. Blend that smooth and then add the mouth. Once you've done that and you think that the head still needs some improvement, work on it as long as you need to get the shape as accurate as you can. This might take a lot of practice, which after a while you'll get the hang of it. I mean, look at my older figures. Anyways, you guys might be aware that Maki has a shit ton of scars all over her body. The reason for that is that the strongest character in the entirety of JJK, Joe Goat, may or may not have set her on fire. Now, the official figures that you can buy mostly rely on painted scars. I personally didn't want that, because it's kinda boring. So I went ahead, used the ball stylus, and added the scars. But before I make the rest of the scars, I still need to add the ears. Using a spiral-shaped clay noodle, I glued them onto the sides of the ear and worked them in. With the ears finished, it was just a matter of baking the head and then gluing it onto the neck. Having blended together the seams of the head and the neck, I took a thin clay strip, wrapped it around the neck, and blended it to the shirt. This is the turtleneck. Before I went ahead and made the scars on the arms, I needed to make Maki's two iconic swords. To make them, I used the leftover wooden plates that I had from the floor and glued the template on top of them to cut them out. After I cut out the basic shape, I removed a tiny piece of wood from the bottom of the blade and glued on a piece of wooden skewer for the handle. I did the same thing with the soul split katana, and once that was done, I had to sand the edges to make it appear more like a blade. Now this part was annoying as fuck, because the angle that I had to do it was really low, and the wood is soft as shit. So I had to be careful not to break the blade and to properly sand it without accidentally sanding off my own fingers. With that part out of the way, it was now time to add the details on Dragonbone. Since there was like a droopy pattern going on, I wanted to replicate it, similar with the scars, by adding texture. That way it kinda reminds me of the manga and looks much more interesting. To achieve the texture that I wanted, I used a rotary tool and a diamond head drill bit and carefully and lightly dabbed it on to the wood itself. It was now time to add the bone pieces of the blade, I guess. For that I used thin wooden pallets and glued them around the blade. Now I don't know what they are, but they are there, so once they were glued on, I covered them with clay and started sculpting. I used Cosclay doll yet again because, as I've stated many times, it sticks very well. However, since Cosclay doll is very soft, I used a heat gun to harden the individual sections that are already finished, instead of throwing it in the oven for hundreds of times. Now I don't quite know what exactly I should call these individual sections. The fact is, since it's called Dragonbone, the entire thing kinda reminds me of a bone, or better said, the spine of basically any living being that has one. And so I tried to sculpt it as bony as I could. And the best possible way to do this was, at least in my opinion, by using a ball stylus. The last detail on the blade were these 3 turbines, or whatever the hell these are. Dragonbone apparently stores kinetic energy and bursts it out of these 3 sections, so what I did was add clay and cut them into like triangular pyramid shapes and then add some lines. I also connected both of the sides on top of the blade and added a small groove. Now this was way too much work, but still better than using a 3D printer, which I definitely do not have. So let's move on to the soul split katana. Because making small blades like that is so much fun. Since I've already made the handle as well as the blade, I still needed to make the pommel. Using 1mm thick aluminum wire, I bent it into a small circle, and I did that 3 times. For 2 of these circles I left a small gap on the top and glued them on top of each other. Once they were glued together, I kinda sanded them a bit down to make them more evenly, and then drilled a hole into the bottom. Once the hole was drilled, I used another wire and glued it in place. And since I've had a third wire circle, I slid it on top of that. Anyways, to finish it off, I drilled a hole into the back of the handle of the blade and glued the metal pieces in place. Now before I'm doing the fur that is wrapped around the handle, I drilled in yet another hole and glued in yet another piece of aluminum wire to be able to secure it better on the arm that is holding the blade. Now at this point in time I had to choose which one of these blades I should use for the sculpture. Both of them turned out amazing, so I kinda had to choose. Now the sword that Maki's wielding in the manga panel that I chose for this pose is Dragonbone. However, I was too lazy to make the cape thingy, and since Maki is mostly using the soul split katana anyways, I decided that I would glue that on the hand. As for the second hand, I went at it as I do every time. First I rolled together some green stuff, and then glued the wires that I've bent beforehand into a hand. I'm not funny. And as always, once the green stuff has dried, I covered the entire hand with clay and sculpted the hand. Once that was finished, I put it in place, covered it with clay again, and then blended the hand and the arm together. With the anatomy of the arms finally finished, I can move on and finally sculpt the scarves that I was talking about earlier. And just like the face, I used the ball stylus to texturize. But after a few minutes, I kinda realized that when I'm gonna paint her, I wouldn't be able to see the outlines of the scars properly. So, to counter that, I used some pointy clay tools to outline them first, and then added the texture using the ball stylus. And let me tell you, this may look simple, but this shit was disgusting as fuck to make, especially due to the different angles that I had to sculpt. Also, since I didn't want to ruin any of the detail that I sculpted beforehand, I had to be really careful holding her, which didn't help at all. And after having spent an entire day making only the scars, I could finally finish the shirt by making the sleeves. With that set aside, I still had to finish the soul split katana. The only thing that was missing is the fur that is wrapped around the handle of the blade. Using thin cone-shaped pieces of clay, I glued it onto the top of the handle, and that's it. Using even more of these cone-shaped pieces of clay, I also made the hair. Making hair like this is always quite the challenge. You can make many things right and many things wrong. So what I did was, as I always do, look up reference pictures and try to get it as accurate as I can. Using some pointy clay tools, I also added the texture of the hair itself. And using some more tiny cone-shaped pieces of clay, I made the hair that is standing up. Other than that, there is not much to say here, but that's Maki finally done. And we can finally move on with the painting process. To start the painting process, I first had to prime Maki using a white army painter color primer to set the first layer of paint. The primer ensures that the paint sticks better to the figure, and also, since it's white, makes the colors pop more. Now the first thing that I'm actually painting are Maki's clothes. To get the color right, I mixed grey with some black as well as a little bit of green to get that green tint that she has going on. I had to do that because most of the time when I mix grey, it kinda looks a little bit bluish, so I needed to get rid of that. And I covered her shirt, her pants, as well as the shoes in the exact same color. Following that up, since I'm cel shading, I added some more black and painted the shadows. I also painted the shadow on the chest that is cast by the arm. A neat little detail which you don't really notice, but it's there. As you can see, I also painted the shadows on the legs themselves. It's a bit of a shame that you don't really see it that well, but if you look, it's there, and that's the point. With the shadows finished, I also added a few highlights along the entire body. Now I don't want to make the clothes appear like they're shiny, so I really had to add just a few of those. Mind you, I painted the clothes first because that way If I do a mistake while painting the skin color, it would be easier to fix, since you can cover lighter colors easier than dark ones. Also, using almost the exact same color, I also painted the shoe soles. That said, I had to paint the skin. And to paint that, I first had to cover the arms as well as the face in the regular skin color. It is now finally time to paint the scars. As I've stated before, it is now much easier to see where I've actually sculpted the scars, so the only thing that I had to do was paint these areas. Easier said than done. Just like with the sculpting process, this was a pain in the ass to make. Anyways, I covered the scars using a brownish, reddish, genuinely no clue how to describe this color, but you can see, and I hope you're not colorblind. Otherwise, I'm sorry. Anyways, since I wanted to add a little bit more texture to the paint of the scars as well, I used some lighter skin colors and dabbed in a few highlights onto the scars. Now I know this doesn't look 100% cel shaded, but that wasn't really the goal that I was going for here, at least for the scars. Sometimes you have to think about what's more important. Do you want to get the two-dimensional aspect right, or do you want the figure to look good? With the scars done, it is time to paint the belt. For that I used a simple brown and a gold for the metal pieces. To paint the soul split katana, I used a dark beige to paint the handle, and then painted the pommel using a reddish color. I painted the fur using a very light shade of grey, and also added a few shadows. To continue to paint the face, I had to add the basic shape of the eyes, which I then outlined using black paint. It is here where I realized that I truly have improved. I know I'm saying this a lot lately, but like I said, it's always nice to notice some things. Anyways, once the eyes were outlined, or better said, once I painted the eyelashes, I also added some lines to the mouth and the nose. Since Maki's eyes are brown, I had to use brown color to make the iris. And to finish the eyes, I added 2 little dots for the pupils. Using a darker red color than the scars, I also painted the cut that is on her eye. Following that up, I also painted the eyebrows, and then it was just a matter of painting the hair the green color that it is. Now Maki might be done, but Dragon Bone is still missing. After having primed it black, I painted the bone parts of the blade. Pretty simple, just use a light beige and then a brown acrylic wash. And to add some more detail, I also brushed some lighter beige on top of that. The turbine areas were painted black, and then it was time to paint the blade itself. Or better said, both of the blades. Now, painting the soul split katana was simple, since it's just silver. To make the separation between the edge and the blade more visible, I also used a darker shade of silver, and I did the same for Dragon Bone. Well, the only difference is that Dragon Bone has a pattern on top of it that, as you guys know, I've made before using the rotary tool. So by mixing black with silver, I painted these areas that I've made using the rotary tool. A small thing that I forgot to record was to add the hair thing at the end of the blade, which I here painted red. Now, since all of the coloration is done, the last details that are missing are the lines. The good thing is, since most of the body is a very dark color, you most likely wouldn't see the black, which is why I didn't bother giving the clothes any sort of line work. I only focused on the arms as well as the hands and tried to highlight the muscles. After all that, it is finally time to assemble Maki. First I put her on the base, and since Dragon Bone was still left over, I added that to the base as well. And since the base would look a little bit empty, I also added 2 separated limbs, as a small little reference to the slaughtering of the Zenin clan. Also some broken pieces of wood. And then I just had to add a shit ton of blood. I added the blood onto the limbs as well as the blades and the floor, since, well, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I also added some blood marks on the blades, to really showcase that she is in the middle of slaughtering a lot of people, which, kinda weird to talk about it like that. And after all that work, Maki is finally finished. Though I do apologize for having taken this long in releasing her. I'll be honest, I have been a bit burned out in editing since I've had to edit the Deku shorts as well as Rocky and now even Maki, so yeah, I didn't really have any time to sculpt anything, so I kinda got bored of it. But now it's finally finished, and the funny thing is that it's releasing on Mother's Day, at least here in Germany. So to all the mothers out there, Happy Mother's Day! I really hope you have an amazing day. And yeah, some might say the release date is pretty fitting for the character. Jokes aside, I am going to take a little break because I need to do some things for university, which I definitely want to do. And after that is finally done and I can finally get back to sculpting, I'm thinking about sculpting Keyframe from Witch Hat Atelier. If you have any other suggestions, you can write them in the comments down below. And until then, follow me on Instagram to not miss anything that I'm doing. And yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Check out my other stuff and see you guys in the next video. See ya!